Hello again, and welcome to video number 2 in the Demands and Struggles in the British Colony unit. Today we look at the essential question: who were the political groups in the colony after 1791? If you think back to last class, or last video I should say, we ended by establishing the fact that the Legislative Assembly was put into government in 1791, and that the Legislative Assembly was represented by people living in both Upper and Lower Canada. Today, we're going to look at the political groups that actually were formed due to many of conflicts that were arising within the Legislative Assembly. A couple of your learning intentions are to indicate the two political groups and their members, to name the demands and interests of each of these political groups, to explain how the structure of government benefited only one political group over the other, and finally you're going to be able to judge the importance of the main issues that were taking place in Lower Canada. I hope you enjoy the video, and let's get started. So at this point, just to review, in 1791, the Legislative Assembly had 50 members, of which some were from the British colonists and some were Canadiens. These two members, when it came time to get together to propose bills, debated on a number of issues, the first being Speaker of the House, then on the official language that the meeting should be conducted in, and then finally on the exercise of power, specifically taxes to build new prisons. All of these conflicts led to a split right down the middle into two distinct groups: British Party, which were the colonists, and the Parti Canadien, which were the French-speaking Canadiens. To add to the increasing tensions established between the British Party and Parti Canadien was the fact that both French and English publications in Lower Canada grew substantially in the 19th century. As newspapers now provided each group a considerable advantage in terms of being able to express ideas, each group then turned to the media in order to express some of the ideas or demands of each of the other party. In 1805, the Quebec Mercury began to publish articles that favored the governor and British merchants, and also sort of put out into society many of the Canadiens' demands in government. In response to this, in 1806, Le Canadien, which was a French newspaper, responded to their opponents and publicized many of the demands that the British members had been making in the Legislative Assembly. So before we really start discussing many of the sort of demands and interests of each political group at that time, in order to better understand it, we definitely need to take a look at some of the changes that were taking place in both economically and socially in Lower Canada at that time. So there was a significant economic change that took place at that time. Up until that point, the economy was more or less dominated by the fur trade. It was the cornerstone of all economics. However, because fur trade became extraordinarily competitive during the 1800s, people were willing to travel to further destinations to acquire pelts. Therefore, the cost of transportation went way up, which meant that profits went way down in the fur trade. Also, at that time, in Europe, there was a conflict going on between Great Britain and France, and a blockade was made, an economic blockade was made on Britain by France. Therefore, Britain turned to its colony in the New World for raw materials, especially timber, because they were building warships at that time. And so the demand for timber went way up, whereas the demand for fur trade went way down. So what you began to see was sort of the demise of the fur trade and the interest in the timber trade, which became the main economic resource at that time. Just on one final note in terms of economy, it was really important to identify the fact that new modes of transportation were being developed. Prior to 1825, all commercial activity was more or less transported by waterway. But because of difficult navigation through waterways in terms of like rapids and waterfalls, the government actually proceeded to put in place new means of transportation like a railway. So they started building a railway which allowed goods to be more easily transported throughout the colony's territory, which had a huge impact on the economy. So while all these economic changes were taking place, there was actually a couple of changes taking place within society as well. So basically, the British people began or continued to have a major interest in making money. So their main interest in society was that of a commercial interest. The fact that the timber trade was now beginning to more or less like explode, like became very, very popular, British business class people said that they wanted to invest and take advantage of that expanding domain. So they started to dominate economic sectors by acquiring wealth and influence. Some of them were interested in politics, but there was definitely more an interest in furthering their own commercial interests. The Canadiens took a kind of a different approach in terms of their society. They began to take way more of an interest in the 18th century in becoming, or advancing, I should say, their political influence. They wanted to gain way more control in government to ensure that they had certain rights. They wanted to protect certain rights, certain interests. And so really their main focus was to gain control of the colony's political institutions. So the British were more interested in commercial gain, whereas the Canadiens were, if you want to think back to liberalism, were really taking on sort of that identity that gaining rights, freedom of expression became really the cornerstone of their society. The other change to society at that time was immigration. So up until that point, the vast majority of immigrants that were coming into the colony were directly from Great Britain. And that continued. However, because of poor living conditions in Europe, you now began to see that the vast majority of immigrants at first were mostly now Anglo-Scottish Protestants and then some Irish Catholic. And this brought some cultural diversity to Lower Canada. These immigrants would settle in major cities, and they provided very cheap labor. The Canadiens, however, were still the largest cultural group at that time, and by 1822, there was about 340,000 Canadiens in Lower Canada and about 80,000 British colonists. So immigration at that time, if you want to look at like numbers, was about 340,000 Canadiens to about 80,000 British colonists. Sorry, 80,000 British colonists. The number of British grew, though, substantially in the following years, and some Canadiens saw this wave as a potential threat. They feared that a rise in the number of British party members could actually pose a threat to some of their rights and some of their political interests. So if we're to sort of take the economic and social changes at that time in Lower Canada, we can now begin to sort of get a better idea of some of the demands or interests of each political group. So the British Party was far more interested in economic gain, and so many of the policies that you would see them put in place directly affected economic interests. As well, the British Party was very much for keeping the status quo in terms of government. What I mean by that is the British Party was heavily invested in trying to maintain the idea that the governor would appoint its councils. The reason is simple. When the governor was able to appoint its councils, the majority of the power in government was in the hands of the mother country, which was good for the British Party because the mother country was Great Britain. For the Parti Canadien, if you look at some of the economic and social changes that were taking place at that time, the Parti Canadien was really, really fearful of being threatened on a political level. If you think back to the previous unit on the change of empire, many of the rights and freedoms were taken away from some of the French-speaking Canadiens. So as a result, the Parti Canadien, many of their demands was for a more They wanted a better representative government. They were asking for a representative government, a more responsible government. They wanted to have the governor no longer be allowed to appoint a council, but what they requested was that they wanted the council to be elected, just like the Legislative Assembly. The reason for that is simple. They wanted more power to go to the people. So the Parti Canadien was very much about distribution of power, whereas the British Party was more about keeping things as it was because it seeked to benefit economic interest as well as to keep sort of the power out of the French-speaking Parti Canadien's hands. So although there were conflicts in government between the British Party and the Parti Canadien at that time, there was also a tension going on directly between the governor and the Canadiens. The main source of this tension actually had to do with debt. So at that time, the governor had certain expenditures. Expenditures is the amount of money he is spending on certain things versus his revenues. So expenditures is the money you're spending, revenues is the money you're generating. Well, as we all know by this time in life, if you are spending more than you're making, you are going to accumulate debt. This debt angered the mother country, and so back in London, they refused to pay the governor's debt in the colony and said basically, figure it out on your own. What the governor decided to do was he noticed that the Canadiens, who are represented in the Legislative Assembly, had a little bit of money in their budget in the form of subsidies. Now, subsidies was the money that they had from the taxation of, from the tax that they got from building prisons and canals. So the Canadiens had a little bit of money, and what the governor was thinking of doing was he suggested, or rather demanded, I should say, that the subsidies be used to balance his budget. In essence, what he was trying to do was he was trying to take the money from taxing the construction of prisons and canals, and he wanted to take that money to balance his book and eliminate his debt. Well, the Canadiens actually were willing to do this, provided the fact that they said, you now need to include us in your expenditures, which means that at the beginning of every single year, when you're talking about expenditures, please consult the Canadiens, and we will help you to better plan for a budget. Well, the governor was not happy about this at all, and so he actually refused that offer. Therefore, the subsidies never actually went to the governor, and his debt grew. And then year after year after year from that point forward, every time it came time to draw up the government budget, the question of how to properly use subsidies resurfaced, which actually heightened the tension between the Canadiens and the governor. So you have to think time and time again, the governor is going to continue to ask or demand that the subsidies be used to pay off his yearly debt. So even though the parliamentary system was put in place in 1791 after the Constitutional Act got signed, it didn't actually stop the growing tensions between the Parti Canadien and the British Party at all. In fact, the British members of the Legislative Assembly actually allied with the governor, the colonial administration, the councils, the business class, and they all opposed the Canadien members' demands altogether. They accused the Canadiens of blocking their bills and were concerned that they were really against the economic development of the colony. As these tensions continued to grow, the Parti Canadien actually divided and became a new party in 1826. They actually became known as the Parti Patriote. And then the Parti Patriote, which demanded that things become more democratic, they demanded more rights for themselves, for the Canadiens, it actually split off into two groups itself. There was a radical wing and a more moderate wing. So the radical wing on the left right there, their primary goal was to change the existing political institution. They demanded independence for Lower Canada. And with the moderate wing, their demands were that they wanted to change the existing institutions while maintaining political ties with Great Britain. So the moderate wing, once again, was the group that still wanted to be a part of the colony of Great Britain, whereas the radical wing really wanted their own independence for Lower Canada. So I hope you enjoyed the video. I know today's was a little bit longer, but I do promise that as we continue with these videos, they will get much shorter. As a way of consolidating today's video, I would just like to remind you guys of our essential question, which was who were the political groups in the colony at that time. In order to successfully answer that question, you need to be able to answer the following success criteria. You needed to be able to indicate the two political groups and their membership. You should be able to name the demands and the interests of each of those political groups. As well, you should be able to explain how the structure of government benefited one political group over the other. And finally, you should be able to rank the order of issues from most to least important and explain your choices. I hope you benefited from today's lesson, and next class we continue. Have a good day and take care.